This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Responding to proposed deep cuts in the portion of the federal budget that funded global diplomacy and development, then Secretary of Defense James Mattis once famously warned that if these items were slashed, he'd, quote, need to buy more ammunition. Making up around just 1% of the federal budget, spending on diplomacy and foreign development assistance is nonetheless perennially controversial. Some critics question the return American taxpayers get on this investment of public funds, while others suggest the private sector is better equipped to implement aid programs. For an examination of the foreign assistance landscape, from Senate appropriations in Washington to program implementers on the ground, we're joined once again by Peter Kranstover, a development economist and retired Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. He also served as policy advisor for the Office of Foreign Assistance of the U.S. Department of State. Also joining us is Art Wigchers, a founding member of the Catholic Relief Services Foundation Board of Directors. Following a successful career with the national real estate and asset management firm Zilber Limited, he's become heavily involved in CRS development projects in East Africa. Gentlemen, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, Peter, as our government type here, maybe you could walk us through a bit how this budget gets developed. It's a line item in a massive federal budget, as we mentioned. It's just about 1%, but there's a lot of things in that 1%. So how does it get there?
Sure. It's one of these things, that will bore you to death, really, if you get involved in it too much. But fortunately, we have good civil and foreign service officers out there building this thing up from the ground in many regards, sending that information to Washington a couple of years before that money is actually, or that request for that money is actually sent up to the Hill, to the appropriators. And so one would expect that an embassy would send a number of different things in, documentation certainly, but also some rationales for providing U.S. foreign assistance in certain areas where those officers happen to be stationed, and asking for certain things such as, in the instance of the Sudan, where I've served for a bit, humanitarian assistance, or water resources, or things like this, health and infant mortality monies. And so those rubrics and the amounts that are requested in that documentation are bruited about in various offices in Washington, and there's a back and forth that goes on relatively continually as the budget process basically comes to fruition about late in the calendar year, around Thanksgiving time, for what is the next fiscal year, approximately a 10 or month horizon. OMB gets involved in this, certainly before ultimately, with the President's approval, of course, going up to the Hill, where then the appropriators and the authorizers of those spending bills get involved.
So, people may have the idea that this is going for, digging wells and whatever, but there's a lot more included in that 1%, is there not?
Yes, although interestingly enough, and it was reflective of budgets these past 5 or 6 years, about 50% of foreign assistance monies are being used as we speak for humanitarian assistance in health and infant mortality and water. So, and that's quite a significant piece of change, and indeed things such as fighting coca cultivation, for instance, in Colombia, or providing sort of some funding to civil society organizations in different places, has diminished a little bit. And it's my understanding that this administration wants to take another look at the entire budget in order to direct it a bit more towards those countries that, in their words, if I'm not mistaken, are a bit friendlier to us and reflect our interests. Quite frankly, not a particularly new stance, and one I think that a lot of people can get on board with, especially when you're talking about a piece of the budget that's usually a little less than 1% of our annual spending.
So, Art, in your experience, there's really sort of two broad categories of this aid, I would think, of humanitarian aid, where we're giving sacks of food to hungry people, and then things targeting more capacity building and development. So talk a little bit about what you've seen on the ground as far as the differences between those two.
Well, I always find there's a challenge, because no matter what you're planning, all at once some kind of man-made or or natural disaster comes, and that can upset the use of the funds. But what I am encouraged by is it seems like, whether I'm talking about Congress or the President, there is more of a focus now on how can we make our money lead to more sustainable development with better resilience for the people. Now that's a challenge because there's always going to be another avenue.
So, USAID certainly has a big hand in these programs, but much of the work on the ground is not done by U.S. government employees. Talk a little bit about how that works. I think that the term of art is implementing partners.
Right, yeah, our implementing partners, right. At least USAID isn't involved in that type of stuff as much as they used to be in the 60s and the 70s, for instance. But organizations like the one Art works for, the Catholic Relief Services, are, reflective of a number of different groupings that we've had contracts with or provided grants to over the years, because of the fact that the federal officer corps in the State Department, USAID, and other places has diminished, and secondly, it just is a bit more efficient in many regards to provide funding to implementing organizations that, in most cases, have had a long history in the countries where they happen to be working. And just as importantly, I think, are oftentimes staffed much more with locals than they are with expats. Is that right, Art?
Correct.
Yeah.
As an example, in Ethiopia, CRS's staff, only of over 200 people, only have 2 people that aren't Ethiopian. And then they work with local partners on the ground, and they're all Ethiopian.
So one of the criticisms of people who are skeptical of this process is just the overhead rates for these sort of subcontractors, if you will. Could you speak to that? I mean, how much of the money actually is in programmatic areas rather than overhead?
I can't speak for other groups, but with Catholic Relief Services, if you look at their budget or their actual results, approximately 7% is for overhead and fundraising, 93% for actual activities on the ground.
Well, as we've mentioned now, you've been involved in this program in Ethiopia. I think we've got a few slides of that program. Maybe you can just walk us through what we're seeing here.
Okay, there's 4 young ladies getting water. What we don't realize is when we read that there's clean water for 50% of the population in rural areas, the government negotiated that as long as your water source is within 1.5 hectares or kilometers of your home, you have access to clean water. And you see in that picture how kids at every age learn to go with their mother to get the water. And that young one, would you want to drink that water?
All right, well, let's move on to the next one if we could. Okay, well, here's a gentleman distributing aid directly there.
Yeah, I had more hair at that time. Yes, that was handing out wheat in south central Ethiopia. And what was really good, working with the local partner down there, the Meki Vicariate, they insisted that we give it to the ladies. because when you distribute the food to the men, it doesn't always get home.
Okay.
There's a little bit of village improvement and things like this involved in that distribution of food, isn't there, Art?
Yes.
And with your locals coming in and also and providing some labor and things for various improvements at times on these kinds of food distribution programs?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You want to hire local people. Now, that's just, think of the warehouses all over the world with aid sitting there for food distribution. That happened to be one of the warehouses in Ethiopia from that picture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, as we said, if there's two general categories, this sort of humanitarian aid, like distributing food, and then capacity building, the project you're working on certainly has a big component of the latter, does it not?
It does. And then what it really came from the traditional tribal leaders, the community leaders, as well as the religious, getting together and saying, what do they have that they'd like to see changed to improve the strength of girls in the 12 to 15 year range and the 16 to 19. The 12 to 15 are in school. The 16 to 19 are normally married and with children. And many of the things they wanted changed are against the law. But you know how tradition, if you've always done something, that's how you relate.
So just walk us through what a program participant might experience.
Oh, well, like in that picture, that happens to be 12 to 15-year-old schoolgirls, and you'll notice a few boys in the picture too. And what it is our program is run 90% by young women because they understand the problem. And they meet for gender clubs. They talk about health, nutrition, life skills. They have tutoring, so they stay in school. They learn, sanitation. And the boys, why they were in that picture, they're invited too. And it's very important for them to understand the problem. You only see 2 or 3 boys there because those were the ones who were picked to be leaders, to do the girls' work for a couple of weeks and then tell the other fellows just how much work the girl does. You get up before 6 in the morning and go and get water, and before you come to school, you're pretty tired by the time you get to school. And their idea is a young woman, by the time she's 14, ought to be able to carry 20 liters with the weight of the can. You've got 45 pounds. Can you picture carrying that a mile or more?
So then what is success for a participant in this program? When do you know you've accomplished what you're trying to accomplish with these young women?
Well, what we have had is we also have meetings with the parents and then parent-only meetings every other month. And that happens to be probably the most important meeting we found out, because so often this is the first time the males and females talked about these issues in mixed company. So this has led to a lot of changes and a lot of young women and men volunteering to be a part of helping the program because they see how it improves their own community.
Which is why something as simple as this kind of thing with food and water and stuff can be a controversial issue in some areas, really, because you're sort of shaking up the structure there, the social structure of it.
Oh.
Yeah.
So if we back it up and we're looking at the next funding cycle, what kind of metrics and reporting is there to decide whether or not this implementing partner should be refunded?
Right. Well, fortunately, there's lots of authorities, legal authorities that officers have overseas, or that an ambassador or an EID director would have overseas, in order to be able to say, looking at an evaluation and certainly hearing opinions from his officers as well as locals in the government as well as the private sector, whether to continue with something or not. Clearly, and we reflect this in our agreements whether they're with private entities like CRS or whether they happen to be with the host country government, that if things aren't going well, we can pull back. the operative line is subject to the availability of funds. And that's allows the U.S. government to basically say, look, you know, we're a little disappointed in the progress or lack thereof on this particular activity, and we're not going to do this anymore. And I've been in a few countries where that's actually happened. So that, you know, ultimately we don't actually bring that money into country. And it's appropriated, but it's sent back to OMB, sent back to Treasury, reprogrammed, to use the jargon. But an evaluative element certainly is always going on there. And accountants are looking at this stuff. Invariably local professionals, you know, who are working with us in the embassy, who have oftentimes been there a long time and who understand our process.
Well, one of the criticisms historically has been there are perhaps elements of aid that are less than altruistic. And I'm thinking in the 1950s and thereafter, there was a good opportunity to get rid of some excess U.S. agricultural output. And I'm thinking in India, for example, we dumped a lot of rice, and people have argued that was actually hugely detrimental to the local economy because, like any other dumping scenario, you're not helping people.
Your prices will hit rock bottom, right, if you flood, just Econ 101. So I understand that was a real live emergency situation. And of course, you know, at the height of the Cold War, and but there was that calculation under what became known as PL 480, Public Law 480, to provide those types of surplus grains and things to cooking oil and stuff like this to a number of places around the world. India, as you probably know, is a bit of a happy story in that regard, though. Over the years, then the Green Revolution took hold there.
Yes.
Norman Borlaug, who eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize, not a Peace Prize for science, but Peace Prize for developing these genetically modified wheat stalks and things. So the good thing about that, at least from a theoretical standpoint, is that let's staunch the bleeding, and then let's sit back and see if we can do something here that, to use that overworked word, is a little bit more sustainable. And that's what's happened, and that's what happened in India.
Yeah, and I think there's a real trend towards sustainability with the U.S. aid people I've met with in the last couple of years.
Well, one of the other phenomena is, I think, a lack of sort of longitudinal consistency with some of the engagement we're working, where, you know, one NGO comes in, does their thing, and then for whatever reason they're not there anymore, and then we start over with somebody else, and there's no logical, you know, follow through. I'd like to read, if I could, an observation. This is a returned Peace Corps volunteer from Mali who said, in this small town there was a market garden built for them by an international NGO with several wells that had been constructed by another NGO. When a fellow volunteer started her service in this village, 2 of the 3 walls had collapsed and needed to be rebuilt. My colleague asked why the village council didn't organize an effort to get the wells repaired, and her neighbor said that they were waiting for an NGO to come along and do it for them. The wells had been built by somebody else, and the village felt no ownership of them, and the people knew someone would come along and fix them, and sure enough, some NGO came along and fixed them after a year or 2.
Right. Well, you know,
yes,
not an unusual story, I'm sorry to say, in some regards, but one that reflects the fact that you simply don't have any sort of local agency or local purchase in developing this, wouldn't you say?
yes. One thing that I appreciate with my business background is the wells I've been involved with through CRS. We approach it like a utility. We have people come in and get trained. I'm talking local people. You have to have guards. You have to work out a budget. How do you pay the people? How much do you charge for water for an individual, or if it's for cattle? And what I found in some instances, the biggest disagreement is, when does your calf become a cow?
Yeah, and you know, this kind of stuff, this is development economics 101 also,
yes.
Right? In that we know are certain things that we know we can do, and that are they are the premises from which you should start these kinds of things. And unfortunately, there isn't, from Washington's standpoint, a lot of sustained attention to these types of things, which require a lot of care and feeding over a long period of time. The budgets are up and down. Every administration that comes in, every 4 years even, right? Some new initiative comes about, or somebody up on the Hill who may have made a visit to a particular country and is interested in that place,
Yes.
you know, happens to want to do something. And that can actually get written into a particular appropriations bill.
Well, I'd like to take a step back, if we could, and look at sort of the whole enterprise of aid. There's a Zambian economist, Dambisa Moyo, who's been very critical of what she terms the aid industrial complex. And one of the arguments she makes is basically it creates a culture of dependency where it actually retards the natural growth of the capacity of these countries, and inserts the donors between the government and its citizens, so that social contract doesn't really develop the way it should. So what do you say to that?
I'd say that there's a reasonableness to that argument. There is also the fact that aid is used for humanitarian purposes, for economic development purposes, and for security and policy purposes.
Yes.
And there's no denying that aid is used in many regards in order to cultivate allies, in order to maintain some type of connection in the multilateral institutions, to be able to indeed assist a country or an organization that happens to be in a particular crisis at a certain time. And from a policy standpoint, and this was particularly true in the 80s and the 90s, move them from, you know, a command economy, a parastatal type of operation, to a free market type of operation with a little bit of money out there offered to the central bank if they took on certain policy reforms.
And one thing that I've seen, like what we do with the 16 to 19-year-old girls, they learn what we call SILK. It's savings and internal lending. But if you stay in this group, you've got to first learn how to save before you can borrow money. You've got to learn not just how to make a living, but you've got to learn a lot of life skills. And it's a challenge because a lot of times the husband doesn't realize what the wife is doing with all these ladies. So it's a whole community has to learn, and they have to do it themselves. And right now, we have about 3,000 women in those kinds of programs in Ethiopia. And if you meet them, they're so proud of what they've done. And really, all we've done is training. They've done it themselves.
Well, one possible metric on all of this stuff is the United Nations has a least developed country list, which it established in 1971. Currently, there are 47 countries on that list, and 21 of the 47 have been on the list since 1971. So what's going on there?
I'd have to take a look. I'd have to take a look at that list, but I should mention the economist Paul Collier, who's at Oxford now, says that, you know, without aid, you probably, well, to put it more positively, with aid, you probably had a 1% share of GNP growth in the countries where foreign assistance programs were taking place in the past 30 years. Without that.
Well, there are 8 countries on this list of 47 in which the foreign aid is larger than the national budget.
Well, for one, you must be, is Afghanistan on that one, for instance? So, but there, I can, off the top of my head, I mean, you're looking at places that are really in conflict and crisis, it seems to me, at this point. And so part of the characteristic of aid is, and by the way, aid and state have it, Pentagon's got some of this appropriated civilian assistance money, and you've got to go in there and basically stop the crisis and provide some type of stability, however that might look, in order to be able to do anything worthwhile regarding an economic growth element. So
well, and that's one of the arguments that people make, is it not? I mean, if the assistance does nothing but prevent a failed state that's in the U.S. interest.
I would argue that it is. I would say that, yeah.
That's true. And one of the challenges you have, like what you're saying, is bad governance makes it really a challenge for people to do the right thing to get ahead. And even with countries that have a growth in GDP, that may be very uneven right now because government controls the telecommunications, the internet, and that's where most of your growth money is. It's not necessarily down on the little rural communities where, like in Ethiopia, 80% of the people live in on rural farms.
You've got 80% of the people there. You've got a growth of over 10% in GDP over the past 10 years in Ethiopia, but a lot of it is in service and infrastructure and telecommunications, and it isn't necessarily, I mean, 31% of your population in Ethiopia still happens to be in the agricultural sector, from 50% just 30 years ago. And your population has gone from 45 million to 110 million just in our professional lifetime. Yeah. And with 45% of those people under the age of 20. So it's, allowing, and Abiy Ahmed, the current president, is doing as well as he can,
yes,
I think, in order to make that happen.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. It sounds like an interesting use for 1% of our money. Art, Peter,
very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on
you.
International Focus.
Thank you.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.